going to run through some case studies, some from Belfast Exposed and some from us. I'm kind of just thinking about different ways of displaying and different ways to of it. So I guess first of all, it's really important to just say that there's not like a particular right way of doing this. The contemporary art is something that's constantly expanding, and curating and exhibition making is something that's always in process and something that is always kind of being revised and being rethought out and restructured. And that's the kind of really interesting part of making exhibitions, is that you're always kind of thinking about it and then rethinking about it and asking questions and considering it from every single angle. Yeah, so like I said, I think one of the first things you need to think about is an exhibition the most appropriate way of summing something up. A lot of the time with these types of projects that you'll be working with, there's kind of like a requirement to have this end kind of final thing. And a lot of the time that usually constitutes the exhibition work is produced, framed, pinned to the wall in some way, and people are invited to come and see it, which is like totally fine, and it's like there's a value to that. But I think that it's just kind of very limiting in what an exhibition can be, and very limiting to that whole process of putting towards an exhibition. So I think basically if the end goal of the project is just to sort of pin some work on a wall that was produced and bring people in, you're kind of immediately sort of limiting yourself. It allows like a really shallow engagement with the subject area and denies an opportunity to take part in something that can be really creative and something quite worthwhile. So I think the most important part of making an exhibition is just asking those questions all the time, considering every decision that you make, justifying decisions and choices, and actually just asking why you're doing something, like why, for every decision that you make, questioning it and talking to people about it. So in this spirit of questioning, and I would like to just open up the idea, first of all, of what an exhibition is. Like, just, you can say anything, like what for you, what is the value of going to see an exhibition, or what do you think an exhibition could be, or just thought I'd put that out there. And again, there's not really anything right or anything wrong, it's just to get your ideas about it.
I guess it's kind of like a progression, like they've worked so far, and the thing that they're doing, and they've had an idea, and they try and explain most of it, or they don't, they hide stuff on purpose, of course, so you translate it a different way. Then you can't carry it on yourself. So everyone comes in and takes something different out of it, even if it's like based on something very concrete, it can still change. And I guess that could be anything. No, that's what I mean. It's
but I think that you have to kind of facilitate an exhibition so that it makes people take whatever they want out of it, or think about it in a particular way. Think around an idea as opposed to just being accepting what's in front of them.
Yeah. I guess it's how much you give away or how much you hold back.
Yeah, exactly.
You don't want to overload people with information.
Yeah, and that's a massive consideration. Like explaining something, what I mean, what it is with your own work. That idea, do you really want people to get it in a way? So how much do you just rely on the work? How much do you feed them and give them loads of information they're not going to read, or how do you mediate it? That's massive. Massive part of it.
So is it like an opening as well? There's always the opportunity to talk to the artist, or to talk to, if you're the artist, to talk to people about your work, like on face-to-face basis as well. If there's like a talk or something about it.
It can be kind of a nice place to be, because it's kind of you're celebrating something. Then I guess it's like what's the point after that? Like, if you're just having a party about it, then what happens then after that?
It's good to get your work out there as well, because it does open up the opportunity for people to discuss the work.
definitely.
Mm.
Mm.
I guess people could be influenced by that and then take it on in a different way.
Yeah.
Like if you see something like an exhibition you like, you might put a bit of that in your own work or be inspired by it in some way.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a recurring thing.
But it's usually the thing, well, I mean, for me anyway, whenever that happens, it's because you're seeing something done in a slightly different way, or in a way that you haven't thought of before,
Yeah.
or maybe, you know, that it kind of is quite compelling in some strange way, and that's when it's inspiring. So, but in order for it to do that, I think then that's the point at which you're like, well, this has to be, you know, there has to be thought in the back end then to enable that to happen. Right, so, do you want to say anything, Jill, or?
Oh, yeah, I never really thought about it that way, but I guess you just trying to communicate your idea.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. That's really important, to communicate an idea. Then you have to have an idea to communicate. Yeah.
One of the things I suppose that's interesting about this particular type of work as well is that kind of you're communicating a group's idea
Mm-hmm.
as well. You know, it's not necessarily your,
Mm-hmm.
it's what they want to say about, say, their identity, their community, their place.
Yeah.
So I think that makes it even harder because you have to.
So that's what I'm kind of going to go into now at that point, because basically this whole area, as you know from your own work and from your research and everything, like the idea of like a collaborative or a community or a participatory practice, working in that way as an artist, is totally fraught with loads of kind of ethical and political dilemmas. And you know what your role is as a curator, facilitator, artist, what your responsibility is. Are you invisible in the process, or do you make yourself visible? Because you know, a lot of the time with participatory work, people say, "Oh yeah, no, it's all the group's work," but it's, you know, there's somebody there who's directing it, who's bringing things in, and so I think it's really important to like to have this conversation, because it's like the actual exhibition making from those kind of projects can be something that is really good and really kind of opens things up and makes things like transparent, makes things interesting, but it can also be really dangerous, because there's that thing of, well, who takes control over this, who's the actual author, and how do you work with the group to make something that's interesting and valuable for everybody. So it's a really, really, really difficult thing to do, and something that will inevitably kind of people will criticise as well, because it's contentious a lot of the time. So I'm going to talk about like 3, and I'm not going to put you off. I'm going to make it exciting and dangerous.
So cool.
But it's just the value of it, you know, like you put something on a wall and it's just like, oh, here we are, it's a celebration. That is fine, and that's something that's really, you know, good to do.
Mm-hmm.
But if you just push it, actual exhibition making is a really interesting and exciting thing to do, and it can just be much more expensive. So I'm going to look at some examples. First of all is this one called Residency by Anthony Rivera. So you've seen it in the bookshop probably a million times, and it was a project from 2008 by Anthony Rivera, who is a photographer. He's really interesting artist, and he's also really like quite influential now, actually, that he writes a lot about this type of work and this type of you know, going in as an artist and working with groups and exploring social issues or exploring a particular area and working with people who have maybe never contributed to an art project before, and kind of he writes a lot about that, how you navigate that and how you negotiate that. So he's quite an interesting person to start with, and we have worked with him quite a lot in Belfast Exposed, and he's actually on our engagement team, and I'm sure you'll meet him at some point in the future because he's back and forth quite a lot. So this project is called Residency, and it's basically, he has a long-term interest in making work about and with people who have experienced homelessness in some way. So photography and something like homelessness has a really kind of fraught relationship anyway, because a lot of the time when you photograph, or if you see a photograph of somebody who's homeless, it's usually them as a victim, or it's usually maybe like a charity photographing them as a way for you to feel compassion, to give money, or maybe it's a way of saying, oh, society's falling apart, look at this. So there is like a relationship already established there between somebody who maybe has experienced homelessness and a camera and a photographer, and there's like definitely a power structure there as well. So his whole process, he had made work in London, and then he came to Belfast and was invited to make work here. So he worked and went into Simon Community and the Welcome organisation, two charities who help support people who experience homelessness. And so he started off, he didn't actually have a group to begin with. He went in, he kind of got to know people, helped out, made food with people, slowly got to know people. If people asked him, he would tell them about his practice, he would tell them about his photography. And then he began really slowly by just inviting people to take photographs, giving them disposable cameras, just taking photographs of whatever. And then developing those quite quickly, and then looking at those with people. And then eventually that kind of grew into what the project became, which was making portraits of these people he was working with, and asking them to make these he coined the term like assisted self-portraits. So he's like hyper aware of his role in this. So he didn't want for him to make the portraits of these people. He wanted it to be them making portraits of themselves, them making all the decisions about the portraits. But he realised that it's not just like they could do this and he has a role somewhere. So it was an assisted self-portrait that he made. So that was like a big decision, I guess, even how you go about meeting those people, the kind of power dynamic, and then all the kind of the limitations in that project. Obviously you've got to be flexible. Obviously somebody might be there 1 week, not there another week. And then what you do with that, what you do with this, with all this material. So I think that the book was always the idea. So to have something that had a collection of the essays, the process is obviously super important in this, as it will be with, when you're making work with groups. That process is basically what the project is about, what happens there, how those decisions are navigated, how people make those decisions, what people are interested in, are they interested, and this is kind of, you can see here, I thought this was quite interesting because you've got a book in front of you, so you can see the final images that are all produced here, and these are all the self-assisted self-portraits, alongside the images of how they made the portraits, the locations that they went to for some reason, and like loads of different reasons for why people wanted their portrait to be made in a certain place of time. And then they've got all of the images along with their name and the location of the portrait. So the book does something very particular. The book kind of gives you everything, all of the information. It's an edited series of portraits. It's got the kind of background. It's got 2 essays, one by Anthony, one by somebody else. And then they decided, for that reason, why don't we do an exhibition that was exposed? But how would we do that? What would that look like? How would that be different to the publication? So these are actually the top picture there is the work installed in Belfast Exposed. So you can see that there's a series of really large prints that are just being taped to the wall. They decided against, making these big frames. They decided against, because I guess the whole thing was about this kind of ongoing process. And they didn't want just to kind of have this really clean show of the final work. They felt that it was really important to show what happened, kind of all the kind of interesting little details, the location shots. So they kind of showed the range of the work in these sort of clusters for each person. And then this is somebody who was involved in the project who came to the opening. And the opening was really low key. It wasn't like a big kind of party celebration. They actually had a big meal in the gallery downstairs. And some of the people who had been part of the project came to that. And then they talked a little bit about the work and what had happened, what they liked, all that kind of stuff. Then this, the bottom picture there, that's the work installed in another exhibition in Catalyst, and that's kind of more recent display of the work. And again, that just shows that's Anthony's decision. This is his work. This is a character from London, and then it's kind of all the background shots and the kind of places that are important to this guy. So I thought that was kind of like that is like a really interesting case study, because it's interesting in the way he met and kind of went about the project to begin with. It wasn't like there was a group that had come to him and asked him to make work on X, Y, and Z. He felt that this was an important area he felt that this was a really kind of an area that wasn't really being looked into. He felt that the people in the portraits never really had any kind of control or power, and he just felt that this was like a really kind of, for him, it was a really important project to do. And it also is just kind of interesting, and maybe in terms of an exhibition, in how, thinking those decisions about what he shows, what he doesn't show, and why he does that. So he's also then just finished an project called Not Going Shopping, which was in Brighton, and it was this big kind of part of this queer festival. And basically he'd been working over like a year with a real massive group of people who, and again it was a call out this time, and who were invited to come and make work with Anthony Vera, looking at identity, looking at what it means to be gay or be transgender in Brighton, and what their relationship to the city was, and what their relationship to photography was as well. All of the only kind of stipulation about the people who were involved in this project was that they were to have no kind of background in photography, and that they had never they weren't coming from like an art background or anything. So again, this it's annoying because we did have one of his news sheets. So we basically, for the end result of this project, there was a book that was produced with loads of essays and loads of work covering all the different artists who were involved in the project. There was also a news sheet with work that had been made by the participants in this, and things that they've written, all the different types of photography that they looked at before they decided on the photo booth format. And that was then distributed free around Brighton for the duration of this festival, and that could be picked up anywhere, and anyone could look at that. And he felt that for him, in a way, that was kind of the exhibition. That was kind of a really big part of the exhibition. The other part of the exhibition was then making these posters. So they made these portraits inside a photo booth. Again, they were self-portraits. They could decide their face, what their background, they could write something, and they made these portraits of themselves in this very kind of private way. Then these portraits were made larger, and then they were finally pasted up onto walls all around the city of Brighton. So that's a very kind of bold thing to do, and it's a really kind of brave thing to do actually. But the fact there was loads of these, and they were all over town, and they were sponsored by the councils and things. So they had like a lot of help doing it. They could get to really kind of prominent places and have these pictures all over town. So it was again it's another way of thinking about how you display it. If this had been shown in a gallery space, it would have been quite interesting, but it wouldn't have had the same impact, and it wouldn't have had. The whole exhibition was about a relationship to the city that you live in and what it's like to live in that place. So this worked really well, and then again, obviously, then each person could decide on where they wanted their photograph to go, why. There's all those considerations as well. So the participants took a real control over this project, and again, it was something that was, rather than the artist going in and dictating, it was him in conversation over a long period of time, working with people and then developing the best way and the most appropriate way and the way that everyone was happy on to display the work. So I thought that was kind of a really interesting example. Then the next example, which we also showed in Belfast Exposed, although this wasn't a Belfast Exposed project, this was a project that was commissioned by, what are they called? Do you remember what they're called? They're called Index and Censorship. So it's kind of quite a political commissioned body based in London. So this is by a photojournalist called Eugenie Dolberg. this is the book here. Again, there was always going to be a publication for this project, and it wasn't really considered as an exhibition until much later, which is also quite interesting when you think about, you know, the end result being this exhibition that everyone comes to. Because in this project, this is basically Eugenie Goldberg is a photojournalist. She wanted to make work about women's experience of the Iraq War, getting kind of beyond media stereotypes and finding out just actually what normal day-to-day life is like. So she worked with a filmmaker called Maysoon Payachi, who made a film of the whole process, which was shown as part of this exhibition when we did it here. She also worked, she had a kind of lead contact on the ground in Iraq, who was a university professor, and she actually was basically the person who found all the women. The women who took part, I think there was 10 maybe, and they were coming from really different backgrounds, really different religions, really different, class structures. There was a really kind of broad mix of women. The women had no kind of background or training in photography. They couldn't actually make the project in Iraq, so they had to make the project in Damascus, which is crazy now when you think about how that political situation has changed. But they went there because they had a bit more freedom to kind of learn about photography. So it was a 3-week residency in Damascus, which is a massive commitment for a group, massive. You know, when you think about, you'll notice in the projects that you do here that maybe from week to week it's a different group. People fizzle out, people come in. So this is like a 3-week project that these women have committed to, that they feel really strongly about, that they want to do. And there was this kind of, her whole methodology was based around just opening up what photography is, and she sort of introducing them to different types of photography, training them how to use cameras, but then also going through this process. I think she called them, life maps. So this whole kind of part of the film, which is just which is focusing on them making these life maps, and it was basically they started at one point on a page and went to another point and kind of closed their eyes and basically like charted their life just with a line going kind of up and down and down further and down further and then up and all sorts. And then from that, then they presented to each other about their kind of story, or their kind of, well, what does this bit represent, what does that bit represent? Which sounds quite cheesy as a methodology, but it's really, really beautiful and really moving. And in the film, it's just kind of really extraordinary, like what these women kind of reveal to each other, and then again what they hold back, and then you find out later about their life. So then, after the 3-week residency, they went back to their houses in Iraq, and they were given cameras, and they were basically asked to document their lives. And then they were brought back individually this time to Syria, and they sat with Eugenie, and then they wrote the kind of story based on these photographs. So, and they're like really different styles, like really it's kind of interesting how different they all are, and what the story that they wanted to focus on for these cameras for each of their projects was. You can have a look at that book. So that was the project, and obviously, it's a really involved project. There's a lot that happens in it. It's photography, it's a residency, there's a film. So again, how do you do that in an exhibition space, and why do you do that in an exhibition space? And so this is what it looked like whenever it was on the gallery wall, which is a completely different experience from whenever you look at it in the book, and it's a completely different experience again whenever you look at it on film. And I mean, this is a particularly interesting project because if you think about the idea of people coming to an opening and they're all there and they all celebrate, well, like none of the women could ever get to see this exhibition. The exhibition's never been shown in Iraq. It's been shown a lot of other places, but they felt that it was powerful enough to be involved with, and they felt that it was, it was doing something positive in their lives. I think Eugenie is a really interesting artist as well because she is very clear about her role as an artist, And he doesn't like the term, even participatory practice. She likes the term collaborative practice because she's working with a group instead of, being this kind of invisible role. Because she's very aware that it's a project she's interested in. It's a project she wants to make. She wouldn't do it if she didn't care about the project. She's completely invested in it as well. She puts a lot into it. So she didn't want it just to be like, oh yes, they've led everything and I'm just this, facilitator. She was very clear that it's actually a collaboration because she kind of directs, what cameras they use, what photographs they look at, and all the time frames and things like that as well. And it's kind of interesting because Eugenie is actually making a project with us now, started in January and it'll wrap up in July. And it's interesting because the whole project, it's being funded through this Paul Hamlin fund that we have at the minute, and it's all kind of like looking at the organisation and experimental learning. But basically, this project isn't to even find a group, it's not to make a project, it's not to have an end result, there's none of that. Basically, this project is just a kind of research and development project where she can find an area, a subject, and talk to people that might be interested in maybe making work or maybe working with her. So it's like a really kind of quite radical way to work, because obviously most of the time when you are relying on funding like we do, you're basically asked, well, what are we getting for our money? How many people are going to be affected? How are you going to improve people's lives? All these kind of questions. And she's basically using 6 months and kind of like quite a heavily resourced project to just think about the structures, to think about those relationships, to think about how that all happens, to think about how these projects are made and the value of these projects. So that will be a really interesting one for you guys to kind of stay on top of, and she'll be back and forth, so maybe even she can talk to you a little bit about it at some point as well. Because it's completely unfeasible, and organisations can't do that all the time. This is just going on because there's no way we can do it. We may or may not have artwork at the end of it. It doesn't matter. But the whole thing with Paul Hamlin is that they're just really interested in the learning that happens. It's kind of an amazing opportunity, but also quite an unusual one. So after that, then sorry, this has been quite long so far. Okay, so basically, these are some questions that I thought would be good to consider before going into a project. And there's probably loads more that I've forgotten, but I was just sort of thinking and thought these are kind of some important ones here. So I think, the first thing to factor in is this kind of, think about this end result at the very beginning of the project. Consider it from the start as opposed to just thinking about it at the end when you've got work and you don't know what to do with it. Listen to people in the group, discuss work at length, think constantly about what is interesting in the project, how people are interacting, and also what the problems are, or what the difficulties are. I mean, art is, so much of the time, is often just problematizing something and challenging an accepted truth, or thinking around an issue, or considering an idea from a different perspective. That is what interesting art is, in my opinion anyway. And so the problems or the limitations or the difficulties within a group, that can often be the thing that is really interesting maybe in the end to make work about, or to kind of make explicit. It doesn't always have to be this really feel-good factor celebration. People it might spark more conversation if you're maybe thinking about, well, did this work? It's okay to maybe talk about, well, maybe it didn't really work so well, but how can we show that in an exhibition, or how can we show that in some form of end result, whatever it is. So I thought that, these are kind of interesting questions to consider. So what are you doing in your project? What are you trying to explore? Is it a case of providing training skills? And if so, that's totally fine, but to what end? What is the project actually for? What's it going to do? Then, is there a theme? Should there be a theme? Who decides theme? Because sometimes it makes a project much smoother if you're all kind of working with this kind of overall framework or idea. Who's the author of the work? But then, at the same time with the theme, then you don't want to impose something that everyone's just sort of bought into, and you don't kind of get the kind of the friction of discussion. So who decides theme? Who's the author of the work? what does the group want from the project? I mean, does the group want to have an exhibition? Does the group want to be at this project? Does the group, what do they actually want from it? And then what do you want from it? Where should the work be seen and by whom? So, if we show something in Belfast Exposed, will anybody that they want to see it actually see it there? What is the value of the project? How should the work be seen? What are the limitations? Confidentiality sometimes, budget, time frame, and then what's the legacy of the project? What do you want the project to do in the future? What's the kind of, the remnant or the legacy after it? So then, if I've gone through that list and you think, okay, well actually an exhibition is a really good idea and I think it could be something really valuable in that, then these are some questions to consider if you decide upon making an exhibition. So where you have the exhibition and why, do you have it inside somewhere, do you have it outside, do you have it in a private space, do you have it in a public space? How should the work be seen and why? What are the budget constraints? What size and why? I don't know if any of you were at that Julian Germain talk, but he was, he made this work and it was all from these people's photograph albums, which were really small. But whenever he showed it in the exhibition, they were all life size and really large and really blown up. And so, but why does he do that? And what are the implications of doing that? And that can be a really, kind of quite effective way of just immediately looking at something in a different way. You can just blow it up or make it smaller or something like that. So you often know. So how is the work mediated for audience? Vinyl, handouts, audio interviews. Do you have too much information, too little information? Why do you have information in the first place? Does it need to be photographs? Could it be something else? Does the work need context? So with Anthony Rivera, he felt very strongly that it wouldn't do just to have those final portraits, that it was really important to show the process and to make really explicit the process, but not in a really dominant, overshadowing way, but to have the large projects that were then kind of clustered around these smaller prints and test prints and landscapes. What form does the work take? Postcards, photocopies, large framed pieces, projected images, sculptural images? Do you need to build structures in order for you to see this appropriately? How is the work made? Prints, collage, sculpture, audio. There are obviously just 4 of a million different ways you can go about it. What techniques and why? Consider the space carefully when you decide upon a space, or if you show it up here. Why are you using that space for one? But then once you are using it, you have to really think about the actual physical limitations of the space. So if you show tiny works in this really large room, it's just going to be swallowed up. Or if you have too much work in a tiny room, nobody can see anything. It feels very detached. How does work fit with the actual space? And can you draw in the actual politics of a space, of the specifics of a space, into the exhibition? Is that factored in? Are you referring to the space, or is it just a white cube that it's just there just to show work in a really detached way? Is there enough room to take in work? How do you tackle having too much work or too little work? What do you leave in? What do you take out? Consider location. Consider somewhere like the history of Belfast Exposed, because somewhere like Belfast Exposed has a history of making these socially engaged projects. So people kind of understand that kind of project. There's a certain knowledge that people bring whenever they come here to look at shows. They kind of understand, oh yes, they make these community-based initiatives and based work. You don't have to kind of explain it away, but at the same time, if you show work that's then really different, that aesthetic of social documentary, that can be really interesting, but it can also be quite confusing, and you need to consider that as well. And then what is the relationship of each piece to each other? So sometimes you can, on paper, you think, okay, we've got this work, and that's what our show is. And then when you are actually in the space and looking at it, it just doesn't work. It doesn't make any sense. It's chaotic. It's confusing. One piece can sometimes dominate the whole exhibition, and others get lost. So it really is, once you're kind of at that stage, it's really being in the space with work, and then kind of waiting for things to happen and playing around with the rhythms of an exhibition and how they speak to each other. And often whenever at that stage, really unexpected and quite interesting things can happen where, maybe there's like either whether it's like a colour or a kind of motif in one work that then completely feeds into another and it links those together in some way. Or maybe you notice that you hadn't noticed before that actually 4 of the pieces are all landscapes but in very different ways, or you can kind of make those connections and you have the work there. And that's also a really exciting stage because sometimes things present themselves in work that you didn't even really think were there. So then, and the final bit is then what is the presence of the facilitator and the artist, and is that something that is really not there at all because it's obviously participants' work, or is it something that you want to factor in there about how it was made and who made it with the group? So basically, that's some questions there to think about. Sorry, I know. So these are just finally just kind of, and these are really crap photographs, I'm really sorry, it was done quite quickly there, but just some kind of examples of really different types of big different exhibitions. So the Venice Biennale, which is like this massive, huge art event that takes over Venice every 2 years, they always have a broad theme, and this year it was the Encyclopedic Palace. So they started off with this maquette here, which was made in the 50s by an Italian architect. He basically had the idea that he would make this encyclopedic palace, which would contain all of the information in the world. That was the idea. So it was pretty much like pre-internet, and this. So now when you think about the absurdity of that, having one building for all the information, but then you think about our kind of desire for knowing everything about archives, about how the internet works, so about how the kind of finding of knowledge has changed, and the kind of ownership of knowledge has changed. It was kind of a really interesting starting point for the exhibition. And then this is just a really terrible slide of someone like Jeremy Geller, who made this parade through the streets of Venice. And Jeremy Geller just really brings people in, and it's all very kind of participatory, and he makes these he had this float. One of the things he does is make these huge parades with groups that maybe aren't seen, like stamp collectors, or maybe on one of the floats he had a canteen of just all these old ladies drinking tea, and they were wheeled through the streets, and he had this kind of timpani brass band that were playing Smith's covers and things, and just really kind of bringing all these people together in a really kind of fun way. And then someone like Tino Segal. So he says that he doesn't make exhibitions or he doesn't make artwork, he makes situations, and he refuses to ever talk about his work. He refuses to have any context whatsoever. The work exists just basically in conversations. This is in the Turbine Hall in the Tate, and he employs people to be there the whole time, for the whole duration of the exhibition. And a lot of the time they're dancers or they're specialists in that field. And this project just involved them coming up to you and asking a question, and then you would respond, they'd ask another question, and they usually have a particular theme. The one in the Turner Prize was about the market, and that, I thought it was crap. But he's really good. I think that was just a really weak show, but I think I've seen other works where it's been amazing.
Oh, right, okay.
I was at this one to document it, and it's a completely pitch black room, and at first you can't see anything. There's people all over the place. And then there was somebody just talking about their house and what they owned. And then about 10 minutes later, people just started dancing, but you couldn't see anything. And it was all choreographed. And then they thought, so a lot of the time, these kind of really unexpected things will happen, that will just start running up and down the room. And then a lot of it, but most of it is just about your engagement with the piece. That is the piece, that is the situation. It's like a one-off event each time. And then this is just a project that I did recently over the road called An Active Encounter, which was all based on this one artwork, and then asking other artists to make responses to this one particular artwork, which was a brick which had been made into a radio from 1968, and basically kind of using that as a starting point. and then asking like 5 different artists to make work around it, and they all made work off-site. And then the only things that happened in the actual gallery were the brick was installed, and then there were these temporary events. There was talks around the kind of issues of this radio, and it was all kind of political, it was all about resistance, and it was all about communication as well. And this is up in Black Mountain, one of the events took place up there. It was completely bonkers, obviously. And then in domestic spaces, sometimes I was involved in this high school project where basically there was loads of artists who lived in the Ormer Road area, and we invited them to make work, and then we had a big festival out of it, and people could go into people's houses and they would experience work in like a very kind of informal and a very domestic setting. And a lot of the time people were just making interventions into their home, and it was completely opposite to the white cube space, because there's all these layers of narratives of people's lives and what you bring to home, the whole guest host dynamic that are there implicitly. So that was kind of so they're just kind of some really different examples of exhibitions, what an exhibition can be, or events even. It doesn't even have to be an exhibition, but it's something that brings people together in a different way. So that's it.